Welcome to the VandySports Podcast on the 440 Sports Network. I'm your host, Billy Derrick. This week's Vanderbilt football pregame show is brought to you by The Wash House, the Murfreesboro Pure Milk Company, Sutherland and Belk, John Leppin, good friend of the show, Wobble Bond Dickinson. Thanks to the student athletes at Vanderbilt University for their dedication, effort, and hard work. Yeaman Packaging Systems, leaders in end-of-line packaging automation. Topics on today's show are brought to you by the Murfreesboro Pure Milk Company. They are a family-owned third-generation milk and ice cream distribution company located in Murfreesboro. That partnership began over 50 years ago with Purity Dairy in Nashville to provide purity milk and ice cream to consumers in Middle Tennessee, and they now serve Southern Kentucky, Northern Alabama, Chattanooga, and North Georgia. Today, they supply grocery stores, convenience stores, and others with Purity products, as well as Mayfield, Nestle, and Haagen-Dazs ice cream. For more info, visit their website at mpmci.com. All right, topics. We're going to preview Vanderbilt and Georgia State. 6 o'clock kickoff down in Atlanta on ESPN+. You can also hear it on 102.5 The Game at Center Park Stadium, formerly known as Turner Field. So we'll preview Vandy and Georgia State. We'll play some comments from Clark Lee about how they've been preparing for some wet conditions on Saturday night. We'll get to 5 things to watch for with Joey Dwyer. Norman Jordan, color analyst from up in the booth on the Vanderbilt Radio Network, alongside Andrew Allegretta and Kevin Ingram. Norm will check in and give his take on the Commodores and their matchup. And we'll get the Georgia State perspective from Brady Weiler from PantherTalk.com to dive into all things Georgia State. All right, today's news. Are you dreading laundry day? Is it stealing time to do the things that you truly enjoy? Well, let the laundry professionals at the Wash House take care of that for you. Today's news brought to you by the Wash House. They've got 2 convenient locations in Nashville. Within 24 hours, you can pick up your nicely folded, fresh and clean laundry, ready to be put away. Log on to washhouseclean.com or stop in today and get your time back. Well, the news is that Vanderbilt is experiencing some severe weather this weekend in Atlanta, with Tropical Storm Francine affecting games all throughout the southeast region. AccuWeather has a 97% chance of rain on Saturday in Atlanta. Here's what Clark Lee had to say when asked about the weather and how it might affect the Commodores on Saturday night.
Well, I mean, some of it is, you don't let the circumstances impact the training that you've had. Some of it is we're going to need to snap the wet ball and handle the wet ball some, and we'll do that. Part of handling the weather is understanding that ultimately it still comes down to each person owning their responsibility, doing their job, and winning their one-on-one, and don't let it become bigger than it is. Does it have an impact on the game? Yes. Does it impact the way we run the ball? No. We got to make sure we're good on the snap, we're good on the exchange, and use it to our advantage. For sure. We have to be ball secure, and it's just the handling of the ball, and we'll see how slick it becomes and how wet it is. I think there's a lot that can happen from now to then, but the process of handling that we need to do in training before we get to Saturday, and we will. And it doesn't mean that you eliminate the option game, just like you don't eliminate the pass game. It's just being smart with when and how, making sure that we look it in and tuck it away. Those are the things, and it's really not deviating from the fundamentals we teach. It's just you can't afford to have a lapse in focus in those moments.
That's Clark Lee this week talking about how his team is preparing to handle some wet conditions, most likely on Saturday night. He said, don't think it's going to expect the run game a whole lot. We'll see with Diego Pavia, Cedric Alexander, A.J. Newberry, and that offensive line. It's going to be really interesting to see if Vanderbilt can continue their success on the ground thus far. This week's all right, pause and then resume. This weekend's meeting is the first time the Commodores and Panthers have matched up. It's the first of a home-and-home with Georgia State coming to Nashville next season. The Commodores are looking to start the season 3-0 for the first time since 2017. Vandy's also got 10 players from the state of Georgia and 7 from the Atlanta area specifically. So a little bit of a homecoming of sorts for several Vanderbilt players. Last week, obviously, big time shutout over Alcorn State, 55-0. That was Clark Lee's 3rd career shutout as a defensive coordinator and first shutout at Vandy since 2019. The defense held the Braves to just 71 total yards. The last time Vandy held its opponent to under 100 yards was against Chattanooga in 2003 against Bobby Johnson. So it's been a little bit since Vanderbilt has held their opponent to under 100 yards there in a game. That win was the largest margin of victory since Vanderbilt beat Presbyterian 58-0 in 2012. Also, a lot of historical context in this game against Alcorn on Saturday. Martell Height became the first player with 100-plus punt return yards since Jonathan Krause back in 2012 at Wake Forest. Also, Nate Johnson, his 56-yard touchdown run is the longest so far by a Power 4 quarterback this season. So big-time win for Vanderbilt on Saturday. They got to keep that going, try to improve to 3-0 for the first time since 2017. And, you got to do it against a pesky team. Georgia State is a team that has knocked off some big-time teams before. They beat Tennessee in 2019. They've held it close with several other SEC teams through the years. They finished 7-6 last season. They're in an interesting spot in their program. That was a good team last year the Panthers had under Sean Elliott. They won the famous Idaho Potato Bowl against Utah State. But in the offseason, Sean Elliott resigned to join South Carolina's staff in the middle of spring ball, which obviously left the program in a tough situation. They hired Georgia associate head coach Del McGee, who has SEC coaching experience. Of course, being at Georgia, great recruiter. He's going to get that program back up and going. He's got a good OC in Jim Chaney, who's spent time at Georgia, of course, Tennessee, Arkansas, very well-respected mind. So Georgia State's going to be well prepared on Saturday night against Vanderbilt. So far this season, they opened with a 35-12 road loss at Georgia Tech, and they're coming off a 24-21 win over UT Chattanooga, a well-respected FCS team. So, they've had a couple of battles. In that Georgia Tech game, and I get into this with Brady Weiler later, they had a few drives that, if they ended in touchdowns, Georgia State's in that game. So, this is a pesky team, a team that you cannot take lightly if you're Vanderbilt. Offensively, not a whole lot to write home about. They're only averaging 18 points per game, but that's through 2 games, small sample size. They are averaging 376 total yards per game, so they've been able to put up some yardage. Just maybe haven't been able to finish as many drives with touchdowns as they wanted to. Let's go through some of their personnel here. Quarterback Christian Villar, he's at his third school. He was at Penn State and then Colorado last season. Didn't play much there, obviously, with Shadur Sanders there at Colorado. This season so far, 448 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. He did have 238 passing yards last week against Chattanooga. So he's a guy that has a good, solid arm. He relies on running back Freddie Brock, who has 134 yards on the season, 1 touchdown. Had a good day last week against UTC, 73 rushing yards. He had 276 yards on the ground going back to that Potato Bowl against Utah State. So this is a good running back with some skills. Ted Hurst, their receiver, is a pretty good player, had 83 yards last week, 109 yards so far on the season, just 1 touchdown, but he's a guy that Vanderbilt needs to be wary of. On defense, I like this Georgia State defense. They've got some athletes. They've got some older transfer guys that likely have a chip on their shoulder. You start with linebacker Justin Abraham, leads the team with 17 tackles. The only returning all Sun Belt performer is cornerback Gavin Pringle. He had 4 interceptions last year. Safety Kenyatta Watson transferred over from Texas. He had an interception against Georgia Tech in week 1. So those are a few big-time players to watch for the Panthers defense. They were the worst Sun Belt team against the pass last year. They allowed 280 yards through the air and 30 touchdowns. So I think potentially there will be some open receivers for Pavia, and if he can grip the football, I think that's a legit concern. I think I'm not saying Pavia is not going to go out there and play well Saturday. I just think it's going to be interesting to see through the air what is this offense able to do, with some wet conditions. I think there will be an opportunity there for Vanderbilt to attack Georgia State's defense through the air. Georgia State's defense, they forced 3 interceptions and a fumble this season. So they've actually been better this year so far. They've been opportunistic. And Del McGee has done a pretty solid job with the Panthers defense so far. So obviously looking forward to kickoff again, 6:00. You can watch it on ESPN Plus. If you want to listen to it on the radio, 102.5 The Game. Speaking of 102.5 The Game, Norman Jordan will join us later in this pregame show. So looking forward to that. But first, we're going to kick things off with 5 things to watch for with my guy, Joey Dwyer. Joey Dwyer back at it with another 5 things to watch for heading into Saturday's Vanderbilt-Georgia State matchup. 6 o'clock. I've been saying 6:30. 6 o'clock on ESPN Plus in Atlanta. Joey will be there. Fortunately, I won't be able to make it, but we will have Joey on the ground there covering for us there. Not Turner Field. I've heard a lot of people call it Turner Field. The official name is Center Park Stadium there, and it looks nice, Joey. I'm looking forward to seeing some of the pictures and hearing about your coverage there and experience. But let's start with this. First thing I'm looking for in this weekend's game is, Georgia State is not Alcorn State, but they're not Virginia Tech either. So I think if you're Vanderbilt, if you sleepwalk, they haven't sleptwalked through a game. So I think sleepwalking through a game is not one of my concerns. But you have to come out here and beat Georgia State, right? You can't just show up and expect, it's like Notre Dame and Northern Illinois. Then you still have to go out there and beat them, because Georgia State is a team that, all goes bad, I think could knock off Vanderbilt. I mean, it's, the line's at 10.5, I think still. Maybe it goes up, there before kickoff. But Joey, for me, this is a game Vanderbilt, they can't play the way they have in terms of, ball security, because that's going to come back to bite them. And, eventually, I'm not saying they've played very poorly, but I just think they've got to, all they've got to do is play clean football, and they should come away with a win.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I think Georgia State's a team that the longer you let them stick around, the more dangerous they become. It feels like their offense is trying to accomplish somewhat of a similar thing to Vanderbilt, to where they're not going to score 50 points, but I think they could be dangerous in the way that they're able to dump it down and utilize their running backs. Vanderbilt's tackling, I think, is maybe one of my biggest things to watch for. I think Brandon Fontenette's going to have a big impact. Langston Patterson's going to have one of his better games. Same with C.J. Taylor. Those guys are going to have to be all over the field. I think they've got to be able to stop the run, and I think they should be able to. You look at the defensive line versus a Sun Belt offensive line, you would think that they should be able to handle it, but it is an interesting environment. You have to go on the road in a place that doesn't have normal football dimensions and things along those lines, and I'm interested to see kind of how Vanderbilt handles it, and especially how its defense handles an offense that I think has somewhat of a similar goal to its offense.
Yeah, you've got about a 60% chance of rain as well in the Atlanta area. So you've got that. You've also got, you mentioned the unique environment. Vanderbilt, I don't know that they've played in a stadium quite like this. Now, should that matter? No. Did it matter at times last year where, they went to a Wake Forest venue that, that's not super unique, but you did have the weather delay there early, like we remember. They had to go all the way out to Vegas. So, Joey, the way Clark has talked about it, it's felt like last year's team was not mentally tough enough to go on the road and get wins. You saw a year before that, year 2 of Clark Lee, they went on the road, beat Kentucky and Lexington. Last year's team was not the best makeup. And we've talked all about this year's mental makeup and all that. A good team and a good mentally tough team does not crumble under this pressure of, okay, you're going on the road, it could rain, it's a unique environment. This is a pesky Sun Belt team that has, they beat Tennessee, I think, in 2019. They've knocked off some pretty good teams. So if I'm Clark and Jerry Kill and these coaches, I rely on the mental makeup that we've talked about, because if they struggle, Joey, that could be a warning sign of, okay, maybe this team isn't where we think they are mentally. But if they come out and dominate, I think it's kind of, mum as usual. Like, okay, this team is still very mentally strong.
Yeah, I think every indication we have is that they're in a good spot mentally. That I wrote a story yesterday about their underdog mentality and kind of how that's going throughout the whole team. You asked AJ Newberry about that on Tuesday, and he agreed with that sentiment. So I think every indication we have is that they're a fun team and they're built well mentally. I think it's not going to be another test in that aspect on Saturday. I think they've passed every test to this point. Virginia Tech was one where they were huge underdogs and they come in and win a game. Now you've got to defend it with some pressure on you. And Georgia State, I don't think, is a team that is super dangerous. But I think if you let them hang around long enough, they become more and more dangerous. I think you're going to have to make them throw to beat you. And that looks like the blueprint to me. I wonder if Colby Taylor's out there. That's one of my things to watch. I mean, he's going to be available, not on the depth chart though, so maybe that's procedural, but it'd be interesting to see kind of what their cornerback rotation looks like and what their defensive kind of packages look like. I wonder if they're going to be a little more box heavy.
Yeah, and defensively is not where I say that's not where I'm worried. Offensively, though, I'm not too worried there either. So all of a sudden this year, Joe, you've got a couple of units that at least when you're playing a Georgia State, you're playing a Ball State, an Alcorn State. You can bank on those. You can bank on your defense rallying to the football, as opposed to you're playing Missouri, you're playing any other SEC team. You start to worry about those one-on-one matchups that you can be exposed by. But you mentioned defense, and that is something I'm watching as well. What new looks do we get? Because as in a Clark Lee defense, we've seen it whether he's at Notre Dame or at Vanderbilt, that he's going to give you a ton of different looks. Do we see things that are totally different, or are they still playing that basic style? I'm not saying they've been basic, but against Alcorn State, that was pretty basic. And so was the offensive side of the ball. So do they open it up a little bit against Georgia State, and then offensively the same thing? Like, do we see a different trick play? Do we see a play that could set something up for an SEC game down the road, especially Missouri coming up? So I look at the different looks. Because offensively against Georgia State, this is not Alcorn State. I think you're going to have to go out there. You can't be as vanilla as you were against Alcorn State and still win this game. Now, maybe you can, but I think if you're Vanderbilt, they're still in this mindset, Joey, of dominating their opponent every week. Like, their goal is to come out here, beat Georgia State 55-0. So, and I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that 10.5 point line, that's another sign of some disrespect as well. I think from Vegas. I think it's reasonable. Right? I'm not stunned it's at 10.5, but you start to think about what Vanderbilt's done this year, you would think it'd be a little bit higher than that. So I look at those different looks, Joey, especially offensively. Do we see a play we haven't seen? Do we see a formation that we haven't seen? And the receivers, I think they still need to get the receivers involved. Whether it's Darian Wiley, I feel like you're going to need those guys to really step up in SEC play when you can't run the football. Because if you think about it, Joey, through 2 games, they've been able to run the football, and maybe that's a good sign. Maybe they play Missouri and they're able to run the ball. Maybe they play Auburn and Kentucky and they're able to run the ball, but we haven't seen that yet. And maybe the opposite happens as well, where they just get stuffed and teams force Vanderbilt to throw the football. And I don't know that they can consistently do that. And so I want my mind to be changed there. Like, I want to see Pavia drop back a few more times than he did even against Alcorn State, and show that, okay, they've got some receivers and the chemistry isn't all bad. But the other side of it is they don't want to show, you still got SEC play coming up, Joey. So you got to kind of walk that line of, you don't want to put too much on film, but you also want to sort of build some chemistry with these receivers as well.
Yeah, I think that's the thing I was going to mention next was the downfield passing game. I'm glad you kind of segued into that. That's something that I'm looking to see from them. And if they can get that going and they only win by 10 points, I think it's a successful day. Eli Stowers and Cole Spence have to get involved more. Got to get the ball back to Quincy Skinner. I think there's a lot kind of untapped there that they haven't really unlocked yet in the passing game. They did it a little bit against Virginia Tech, but, their passing numbers have not been lofty at all throughout the year thus far. If they can go out and they don't have to put up 300 yards, but if they can have a more productive passing game that helps them move it down the field and it's not all ball control, I think it's going to be pretty interesting to watch and a lot more fun to watch than maybe it would be if they're just running it up Georgia State's throat the whole time. So I think it's going to be interesting just to see how do they utilize the pass game, what do those looks look like, and it is going to be interesting with the rain because I wonder how much that kind of combats the downfield passing game. But if they can show that they have that and they can consistently turn to that, because I think their offensive line is good, but once they get to SEC play, I wonder kind of what does that look like against the Mizzou and Alabama. They're going to have some bailout with the downfield passing game, and I think this is the week to where you're looking at it and saying, well, maybe they could get Junior Sherrill involved, maybe they could get Quincy Skinner involved, maybe they could turn to the tight ends a little more, or find Cedric Alexander a little more out of the backfield. So that's kind of my thought here is just I think this is the week that you're looking at as one that you're really thinking they might have to take a step forward in the downfield pass game, not to win this week, but just to convince you for the next couple weeks.
Yeah, last thing I want to get to here, Joey, is what can we learn this week? We talked about last week against Alcorn State. We didn't learn a whole lot. I think a lot of that was reaffirming what we already knew. Following the Virginia Tech game. Coming into this game, I think we can learn a decent bit. I think number one, we can learn about how this team could fare on the road down the stretch of this season, because it's not an imposing environment, but anytime you have to go on the road and win a game, it's not easy. And this is a pesky Sun Belt team. They're not very good. This is not a team that Vanderbilt should be in danger of losing. I mean, it's not. Now, I'm not saying this game's not going to be close for a little bit, but Vanderbilt, I'm interested to see that, like that. Okay, you're going on the road for the first time. We could learn how they fared down the stretch of the season. Another thing for me is, this, we talked about it a lot. This team is not Alcorn State. Can Vanderbilt go out and beat a team that has a chance of beating them, but shouldn't beat them? Right. Alcorn State did not have a chance of beating Vanderbilt, and they shouldn't have beat Vanderbilt. And that obviously that's not even in the equation. But this is like putting the pressure on Virginia Tech. This kind of reminds me of Virginia Tech versus Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt fans were saying that, hey, we can beat this team. If we do these things. While Virginia Tech fans were picking 45-14 dominant wins. And that's what this kind of reminds me of. I think. We haven't heard a ton from Georgia State fans, but I would assume their staff and some people associated with their program, they're excited. They get an SEC team at home at night, at their home stadium, and they're feeling good. They're feeling excited. I'd be excited. For Vanderbilt, you're kind of walking in here. Okay, we should take care of business here. We know we can beat this team. So that's another thing. Can Vanderbilt knock out everything else? All the rat poison. Nick Saban has talked about. Can they eliminate that and just go beat an opponent? And also, you mentioned the downfield passing game. I think we can learn a little bit more about that. Each week we can learn more about that. But I think they're going to. I have a feeling they're going to have to Saturday night. Now I could be totally wrong, and they could just run the football and find a way to beat Georgia State. But I have a feeling, Joey, they're going to have to move the ball through the air consistently Saturday night. At least certain possessions, So those are a few things I'm watching and looking to learn. I'm not sure if there's anything you think you can really learn here, because for me, it's not Alcorn State. This is an opportunity for us to learn more about this team.
Yeah, I think they've got a chance to reaffirm a lot of things we've learned in the first 2 weeks, and I think that would be the best thing for them. Just reaffirming the mental makeup they have, reaffirming that they can go get it done in a multitude of ways. The two things I'm looking at that we can really learn in a positive way is that they have a better downfield passing game than we've seen. And when you talked about that, I think that's really important for them moving forward. And then I think the tackling and just their ability to stop the run against a team that really wants to run and really wants to use short passing to kill Vanderbilt. I think if they can stop that, that's a huge testament to what Clark Lee is able to do. And to the guys they have on that defense, I think they've got a lot more speed, a lot more length, a lot more athleticism. And it's time for them to show that. I think their defense they were fine against Virginia Tech. They're really good last week. But I think it's time for them to step up to the plate again and show that they're made of enough to where they can stop Georgia State from doing what it wants to do. I mean, they're bigger, faster, stronger. They should be able to stop this team and slow them down regardless of how good their running backs are. Vanderbilt's got to be Vanderbilt and got to be the SEC team on Saturday. And a multitude of ways, you got to be able to throw it down the field. They got to be able to win the line of scrimmage. And I think that'd be very affirming for a lot of what we thought throughout the offseason.
That's Joey Dwyer previewing Vanderbilt-Georgia State. 6 o'clock kickoff Saturday night. You can watch it on ESPN Plus there in Atlanta. Joey, thanks as always.
Yes, thank you.
Always great to dive into this week's matchup with Joey Dwyer. Before we move on to the interview with Norman Jordan, which was great, let's get to a few sponsors. Our guest line is presented by John Levin, good friend of the show, Its company, Wobble Bond Dickinson, they thank the student athletes at Vanderbilt University for their dedication, effort, and hard work. Our guest line is also presented by Yeaman Packaging Systems, leaders in end-of-line packaging automation. Also, last but certainly not least, Sutherland and Belk, a family-owned injury law firm. They have been the longest-running sponsor of VandySports.com. If you or a loved one has been hurt or in an accident, give Taylor or Russell a call, 615-846-6200 to see what your rights are and if they can help. Now, on to the interview with Norman Jordan.
Norman Jordan, Vanderbilt football color analyst, alongside Andrew Allegretta, Kevin Ingram. You can hear them on 102.5 The Game. You can hear them also Saturday, 6 o'clock is when that kickoff is. Vanderbilt and Georgia State down in Atlanta. Norman, what are you most looking forward to this weekend? Obviously, Vanderbilt through 2 weeks looks like a completely different team. I mean, as soon as that ball was dropped on Saturday against Virginia Tech, I think everyone knew this team was gonna look a lot different this year. We'll see what this turns into this season. But as an alum, as a former player, we'll start there. What has these first 2 games, just meant to you in general?
No, the Virginia Tech win was just huge. We've seen it so many times where you miss the field goal at the end of the game and then the team collapses. Well, going into overtime, coming away with the overtime win. That was a good Virginia Tech team. I don't think they're great, but they're certainly good. Then last week they took care of business the way they needed to take care of business. Yeah, what I'm looking for coming up this week is it's going to be the same story all season long. Can they execute their game plan? Can they play complementary football? Something Clark talks about all the time. Can the offense go out there and eat up some clock and score? Can the defense go out there, get in position, and keep teams from having these long, hard drives, or keep them from having these really quick, gashing scores?
Norman, after Alcorn State, you look at that game, you go, man, 55-0 shutout, first shutout since 2019. A lot of, other notes. You had the punt return from Martell Height. That was the first time anybody had over 100 punt return yards since 2012. Jonathan Krause. I mean, after that effort, what did you? I mean, were you able to learn much after last week? Joey and I talked a lot about, it's hard to learn a lot after a game like that. What, if anything, did you take away from last week?
They took care of business. They did what they were supposed to do. You've got to have 11 guys out there doing 11 jobs and doing it as one unit. And that's what both sides of the ball did. I mean, to me, the most impressive, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think Alcorn State crossed the 50-yard line. I think they got to the 49 at one point, but they never crossed the 50-yard line. That's defensive dominance. Then on the offensive side, they had so many people, different people score. It wasn't one person. It wasn't any one thing that they found that Alcorn State wasn't good at. They just executed their offense, and things happened from all over the place.
And so through 2 games, you look at where this team is at, and, I think there's a lot of people surprised around the country, Norman, quite frankly. I mean, I don't think anybody expected Vanderbilt to go out and beat Virginia Tech. I know there were people, every player and coach, probably did. But now that they're 2-0, do you think that puts pressure on them? Or do you think at a place like Vanderbilt, it's almost impossible to feel the pressure? You almost always feel like the underdog no matter what.
In my opinion, I think one of the things, if you're playing at Vanderbilt, you've got to play with a chip on your shoulder at all times. Every game you go out there, even if you're favored by 3 touchdowns or whatever, you got to go out there with a chip on your shoulder and know that you've got to earn the respect of your opponent and your future opponents. And that's one of the things that we did way back when I was playing is, we felt like we had to prove ourselves, and I think this team right here has got to have the same attitude. We've got to prove ourselves, and we prove ourselves by executing what the coaches ask us to do. And if you do that, you start believing in yourself more and more, and then all of a sudden, things are rolling downhill, and you're excelling.
You mentioned your teams there, your era at Vanderbilt, and I've heard some comparisons to Diego Pavia, to Whit Taylor. to a quarterback like that. Obviously, you know him pretty well, and Watson Brown, and I mean, obviously, I was not alive during that time, but there's some older people that remember that and point back to that. They're watching this offense and they go, man, that reminds me of Whit Taylor. That reminds me of Norma Jordan and that Watson Brown offense. Do you see any similarities between what Vanderbilt's trying to do this year and what y'all were trying to do, under Watson Brown offensively?
Well, one thing I see is definitely a comparison between Diego and Whit, and that is that they are both great leaders. That they're willing to do whatever it takes to win. They put in the hard work. They do all the things that they've got to do to win. And a great leader is not always the guy that shouts the loudest or talks the most. It's somebody goes out and does it by example. For example, when we were playing, when Whit stepped in the huddle and things were tough, the linemen were kind of griping, some he'd say, shut up. And we'd have to tell the linemen after the game they could talk again. I mean, when he said shut up, they would shut up. So I see the same thing in Diego. Whit was, I think, a much better passer. But Diego, I mean, as a leader, there's not anything that they ask him to do that he can't do or won't do. So that's, in my book, the guy's just a warrior. He goes out and does everything he's got to do to win. And I think one other thing that Diego brings to the table is basically that Diego knows the offense, and he knew it coming in, and he executed at a high level last year. And I think that gives Vanderbilt offense an edge right there, that they've got somebody out there. It's like having a third coach out on the field. And, when he's out there, he knows what he's doing. He executes it. He does what the coaches ask him to do. So, I mean, it's been certainly a pleasure to watch.
Yeah, you talk about Diego, and obviously took a couple big hits last week against Alcorn and against Virginia Tech, slammed to the ground a few times. He gets right back up every time. Clark said he's a warrior. I mean, it's like the kid can't get hurt. You talk about, man, you got to be wary of that when he's going down to the ground, but at the same time, you don't want to hold him back. So how does Vanderbilt make sure they're smart enough when they run him?
I mean, a couple of things. One is that Diego is a smart player, and he's not going to put himself in a situation where a linebacker and a defensive lineman have a straight shot at him. I mean, he's pretty foxy. He'll get down when he needs to get down and not take the direct hit. That's just one of those things you learn down through the years as a player. So that will help him. But the other is he doesn't know any other way to play. And if you take that away from him, then you don't have Diego Pavia at that point. You've got some shadow of who he is. And that's part of who he is. And that's why those linemen and why everybody out on the field and everybody on the sidelines respects the guy, because he goes out and gives it all he's got every time.
All right, lastly here, Norman, and again, really appreciate your time. Obviously, with this is a big game for Vanderbilt. Clark Lee talked about it's a big game to chance to get to 3-0 for the first time since 2017, heading into that Missouri game. What are your expectations for Saturday night, and what are some things fans should be looking for as Vanderbilt plays a Sun Belt team that maybe isn't the best Sun Belt team this year, but they've been pesky. They beat Tennessee back in 2019, and you're playing at their house. So what can we expect Saturday night?
You go on the road and you're playing in a new stadium, a stadium nobody's played in, none of the players on your team. That's usually worth about 7 points to the team that's at home. So you expect that to happen. But you get out there and if you can get a good quick start, then that takes a lot of that away. Early in the game, if you're playing against somebody, you're sizing each other up. And Georgia State's got a bunch of really good athletes, and they've got some really good coaches, a lot of former UGA coaches. So they're going to be a well-coached athletic team. So if you're Vanderbilt, you've got to do the same thing you got to do against the SEC. You've got to go out and execute your offense. It's something they don't see much of. So you go out and execute and do what you do. Take what they give you. If they're giving you the give play on the RPO, give it to the running back and let him run. If they're making the quarterback keep it, keep it. Just make the right reads, take what they give you, and execute your offense, execute your defense. It's pretty simple.
Looking forward to it. Saturday, 6 o'clock. Norman will be on the call down there with Andrew Allegretti. You can hear them on 102.5 The Game with their coverage, I would assume, starting around 4:30 there on 102.5. So, Norman, have fun this weekend, and hopefully Vanderbilt comes back with a W.
Billy.
To close out this week's pregame show, now happy to be joined by Brady Weiler from GSU Panther Talk inside Georgia State Sports. Brady, this weekend should be interesting. Georgia State and Vanderbilt, a matchup that hasn't ever happened, right? Georgia State will come to Nashville next year. But, I think a lot of Vanderbilt people are looking at this going, okay, this is a team Vanderbilt should handle. But Georgia State historically, you go back to 2019, knocked off Tennessee. They've got good coaches. They've got good athletes. I think everyone knows that Vanderbilt's going to have to come out here and really play well to beat Georgia State. Really appreciate you taking the time today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. And this is the second power conference school Georgia State will host at Center Park Stadium. The first was UNC a couple of seasons ago. And so that was Drake May, UNC, and ended up being a close game. But I mean, Georgia State fans would be lying if they didn't think this was a better opportunity to pick up a win than that game going in against a good UNC team. But I think this is, like, as I was going into this matchup, this is one of the best versions of Vandy I think Georgia State could have expected to play. They beat Virginia Tech, which surprised a lot of people. And so even though maybe a year ago looking at this matchup, there was maybe a lot of interest of like, ooh, maybe this is a spot. Georgia State's going to have their hands full with this Vandy team on Saturday.
Yeah, we'll talk more about the matchup. I want to get into some of the background with Georgia State. Obviously, Sean Elliott resigns and heads to South Carolina in the offseason. Del McGee is promoted, who has experience at Georgia. Also, Jim Chaney, as the offensive coordinator, spent time at Georgia, Tennessee, and Arkansas. A very well-respected offensive mind. And the Panthers have some athletes. So give us a little background on the Panthers and kind of how everything with Elliott went down last year and how they've had to sort of piece together a roster a little bit.
Yeah, definitely not what I was expecting as a spring football, whole ordeal, because I was planning to go the morning for practice and get some quotes from Coach Elliott, players, whoever, and woke up to text. It's like, practice is off. Sean Elliott is off. And so certainly it was an adjustment. I think maybe from the outside, there was a bit of a misconception. I know there was some word going around that like they didn't have spring practice after Elliott left, which is not true. Del McGee came in and they pushed it about a month, but they actually still finished their 13 practices ahead of some FBS programs who did not lose coaches. So at a certain point, it almost became like a normal spring, just minus a couple practices, but a lot of change. And, even before Sean Elliott left, running back Marcus Carroll ended up at Mizzou, had 1,350 rushing yards last year. Top receiver Robert Lewis transferred to Auburn. Darren Granger, who had been the quarterback for basically the last 3 seasons, ran out of eligibility. And so even before Sean Elliott left, this was going to be a year where there's going to be a lot of new faces. But then obviously a new coaching staff came in and brought in a lot of players over the, I think 48 was the number that Dell put it at, that they've added. A fair amount of them are playing significant roles for this team. So a lot of change. And you mentioned all the SEC, Jim Chaney, Del McGee, very clearly a part of what he was looking for in putting his staff together was people who knew what it was like to be in an SEC building, because at whatever level he can do it at Georgia State, he wants to replicate, what he was a part of it with Kirby Smart at Georgia and kind of building the program that way. And so for him, would you add the recruiting side as well as just like what the day-to-day looks like? He wanted a staff that wanted to knew how to implement what he wanted to run here.
The Panthers started the season at Georgia Tech, lost 35-12, and they're coming off a close 24-21 win over a UT Chattanooga team that obviously well-respected FCS team this season. What have you learned so far about Georgia State? Has any of your opinions changed, as opposed to what they were before the season started? And, coming into this matchup, do the last couple of games give you some confidence that they could hang in there with Vanderbilt?
Yeah, I think the thing that I was struck by watching the Georgia Tech game, and even though it ended up being a 35-12 loss, so the score looks lopsided, they had chances to hang in that game more than they did. They ended up having 3 trips inside the 10-yard line, 2 of them inside the 2-yard line, and they got 3 points out of that. If you get touchdowns on 2 of those drives, it's a different score, if nothing else. It looks closer than it was. They were able to move the ball in that game, and that impressed me. I just think there's an air of competence, and you can tell that the coaching staff has been able to get across the game plan well. And I think you weren't sure with the first-time head coach because organization, like this is the first time he's doing it at the college level, and there's a lot of moving parts there. And so I think encouraging to see just the level of like they feel like they're getting the best out of the guys they have. The issue is they've been leaving those opportunities on the board. And it wasn't so much that against Chattanooga, but they were up 10-7 in the second quarter. They had a drive get down near the red zone that ended up in a missed field goal, and then they took over at the 36 on a fumble, and that drive did not go anywhere. And so there was an opportunity for the Chattanooga game to be a little bit more comfy. They could have been up by double digits at the half, get the ball out of halftime, and then you're not going all the way to the final minute of the game trying to protect your lead. And so it's a team that's maybe able to hang in some games, able to get the most of what they have. And they have struggled with that killer instinct in times, especially when they have a lead. And so I think what I've learned is they're going to be in a lot of dogfights in conference play. And, they hope this Saturday, and they've got to figure out a way to win more in those moments where they have a chance to take advantage of something the opponent gave them. And they've struggled in that regard in the 2 games so far.
Let's get into some of the personnel with the Panthers this year through 2 games. Obviously not a big sample size, but quarterback Christian Dwyer is at his 3rd school. He was at Colorado last year. He's got 3 touchdowns so far. Had a really good week last week against UTC, 238 passing yards. At running back, you look at Freddie Brock. Receiver, Ted Hurst leads the team so far with 109 yards. And then I look at a couple of pretty good players defensively. Talented transfer in Kenyatta Watson, and you've got Gavin Pringle back there, who was an all Sun Belt type guy last year. Go into some of the personnel for some of the Vanderbilt fans that may be unfamiliar with what the Panthers have to offer this year.
Yeah, so on offense, it's a pro style. The old cliche with Jim Chaney is brought in. For the first 3 games, it's been a lot of quick passes out, and I wonder how much that's going to change this week, because I saw Virginia Tech tried that against Vandy in week 1 and didn't go super great for them. So I think they're going to have to show something else schematically. But yeah, Christian Dwyer, the quarterback, transferred. He was a guy that the staff brought in. So on some level, I was pretty sure he was going to win the job eventually, but he ended up getting it out of the gate. He's getting passes out on time. He's got a nice arm. And there were a couple of throws in the Georgia Tech game that he put him right on the numbers and they got dropped. And so as they're maybe looking to get more deep shots, I think they have the quarterback with the arm who can hit those. It's just about those opportunities being there. Yeah, you mentioned Freddie Brock, but it's honestly like the biggest committee I can remember Georgia State having at running back, because you've got Freddie Brock, you've got Michael Dukes, a USF transfer, and he used to be at Clemson as well. You've got CJ Beasley, who has not played this year, but was a good running back for Coastal. He's been dealing with an injury. He might be back this week. It sounds like it's getting pretty close there. Jordan Ford, who also handles kickoff duties, transferred in from Tulsa. And Savion Wilkerson, who transferred in from Colorado and had a nice 41-yard run against Georgia Tech on that first drive. That was kind of like they're here to play moment. So you're going to see, I think, all of those guys, maybe not Beasley, but at least 4 running backs. And then on perimeter, Ted Hurst had the big game on the outside. Him and Petey Tucker, I feel like, are the big targets, like your traditional wide receivers on the outside working on the main corners. But then also Tyleek Williams and DJ Riles in the slot. And DJ Riles is a guy, they've moved around a few spots. He actually was a quarterback at Middle Tennessee last year. He transferred in. They basically immediately moved him to receiver, but there was some plays. He lined up at running back and motioned out. He's been in the slot. He's been on the outside to get him in the screen game. And I think as they're looking to maybe hit some more big plays, you're looking at maybe Williams and Riles as the guy who can make something happen in the slot, but pretty balanced, no real superstars, like taking all of the stats, but I think that helps them because it's harder to prepare than having, the one guy you just got a blanket.
Well, I like to ask this to a lot of our guests that come on from the opponent's side and obviously know everything in and out from the opponents. What's going to tell the story of this game for either side, right? What's something that you look at, whether it's a matchup or a certain time of the game or whatever it might be. What's going to tell the story of Saturday night's game that maybe lets Georgia State compete, or something that might, let Vanderbilt get loose on them and extend their lead?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to come down to how Georgia State handles the trenches on offense, because I don't know that they're going to necessarily dominate, but can they get a foothold? Can they put some drives together? Can they get the inside run game going, which they haven't really been able to do in the first 2 weeks? And I say that because of what I mentioned earlier, that the way that they've run their scheme the first couple of weeks, I think if they are stuck doing the same things and they can't get the run game going because they're kind of working the screen game because they haven't been able to consistently get push up the middle, then I think that'll get them behind the sticks. I think Vandy's going to be able to handle that, be ready for that, have guys on the outside that can stick with the fast receivers Georgia State's got and running backs they're going to throw on these screens. And so whatever they're able to do in that regard will make a big difference, especially because I see this playing out in the best circumstance for Georgia State. It's going to be a game they win like 17-13. I don't see them putting up a ton of points. And so they're going to have the offense stay on the field. And they've done that through 2 weeks. They almost played a level time of possession with Georgia Tech that it was 2 seconds. It was 30 minutes, 2 seconds to 29 minutes, 58 seconds, which I think was an achievement. And then they won the time of possession by 7 minutes against Chattanooga. So they've been able to hold the ball decently on offense, despite really not fully clicking in the run game. But whatever they can do against a very stout Vandy defense is going to tell the tale here, I think, because I think the defense can keep Georgia State in a lot of these games. I think it's a good defense. They're well coached, and the only issue for the defense has been kind of the big plays, especially in the passing game. So they can avoid some of those, and if the offensive line can meet the challenge of a good SEC defense, that could be the way Georgia State's able to kind of cobble a win here.
Lastly here, I love the venue. I've been to Turner Field before. Obviously, it's been renamed to Center Park Stadium there in Atlanta, and it looks beautiful. I mean, just looking at the pictures, I'm not able to go, but I do know a lot of Vanderbilt people that are making the trip down, and excuse me, just looking for a fun night there. Hopefully the rain stays away, but give Vanderbilt fans a look if for Commodore fans that are heading down, anything to know about the venue and just kind of how that process has been, because the last few years it's really been transformed into what does look like a football stadium, as opposed to looking at some of the other baseball venues that they've played football at, and you can really, okay, this is a baseball stadium, but I mean, you almost look at this and go, man, they've done a really good job of making this look more football oriented and football centric.
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing to say is if you have been to Turner Field, you will recognize it as it being Turner Field if you've been there as a Braves, to a Braves game. Like, you can still tell it was Turner Field. But you're right that they've kind of made the main bowl, like, you could forget that it was the baseball stadium very easily. It's still a work in progress, I'd say. There's the right field seats, or what used to be the right field seats, are still there, and like the outfield seats are still there, but they're not there for seating for football games. So at a certain angle, you can kind of see the inside of the stadium still, and it's not what they necessarily wanted to be as the finished product. But with the basketball arena they had to build, and now baseball is next on the docket, like, there's been other priorities, and Georgia State as a department cannot make all of these big projects happen at once. But when you're in the bowl, it is exactly what you're looking for from a football stadium. And I don't know what the crowd's going to be on Saturday, but down the line, when it's a situation where Georgia State is able to more consistently pack that stadium out, it will be a good venue for college football, I think. And Summerhill is the neighborhood that's right there that I think is having the regeneration they might have been hoping Turner Field was going to bring them. It didn't really do. So there's some bars and restaurants. If you're not doing the tailgating thing, there's some bars and restaurants within walking distance, at least some restaurants and places that sell beer. There's the brewery Halfway Crooks that's down that way. So you got options, not your typical, not like a college campus, run of bars, not like a row of sorority fraternity houses you're walking through to get to the stadium or anything, like parking lots around the stadium, but it's growing. It'll get where they needed to be eventually, I think. And for now, it's a good place to watch a college football game, I feel.
Looking forward to it. I'll be watching it on TV there, ESPN Plus, 6:00 kickoff down there in Atlanta. Brady, thanks for taking the time, and enjoy your weekend.
Yeah, thanks. You too.
Really good perspective there from Brady Weiler, who covers Georgia State there for PantherTalk.com. Looking forward to Saturday night's matchup. 6 o'clock kickoff, Vanderbilt and Georgia State from Center Park Stadium, the former Braves Stadium known as Turner Field. Looking forward to it. Obviously, it's going to be rainy, wet conditions with Tropical Storm Francine rolling in, but either way, we've got Vanderbilt football Saturday night, and the Commodores are looking to move to 3-0 for the first time since 2017, heading into that matchup, that big matchup with Missouri in Columbia. Before we wrap it up, this podcast has always been free, and we plan for it to be free. So here's how you can help keep it that way. Number one, give the podcast a review and a 5-star rating. That helps us get noticed. If you're listening and you haven't subscribed to VandySports.com yet, please do. It's $99 a year and helps us tremendously. Also, go subscribe to our Vandy Sports YouTube channel. If you're watching it right now, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We would love to see that. Also, finally, if you're interested in sponsoring the show, email Chris Lee at chrislee70@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you again soon with more episodes of the Vandy Sports Podcast.